Story 1, yes, but not in the way you think. Realistic meant something that resembles reality, so games like Tekken, Mortal Kombat, and Metal Gear were really close to something you might see in real life. Now, realistic is just another way to say photorealism, featuring enhanced graphics with good ray tracing and shaders. Story 2. Seeing Super Mario 64 was a paradigm-shifting, knock-my-socks-off moment, similar to how people are reacting to generative artificial intelligence video now, but far less depressing. Story 3. The move to three-dimensional graphics was the real draw. Spending 2 decades in two-dimensional graphics and then having these open worlds was another level. Being able to explore these open three-dimensional worlds, such as Tomb Raider and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, was mesmerizing. Then Gran Turismo 3 happened. Story 4. PlayStation 1, no, that was still blocky and rough to me. The seams were all still too visible. The PlayStation 2 era felt like an incredible leap. Madden had grass. Full motion videos started to fade because in-engine graphics were good enough for cutscenes. The ice melted in Metal Gear. Ragdoll physics took over. Story 5. PlayStation 1, Sega Saturn, and Nintendo 64 were nice but not realistic. For me, it was Final Fantasy X for the PlayStation 2 that did. I did not think it looked real, but the graphics felt realistic for the first time. Story 6. I was too young to view it through a lens of realism. It was just video games to me. When the original Xbox first came out, I honestly thought a real football game was being played. Turned out my cousin was playing Madden. Story 7. The games were a decent leap, but the cutscenes were mind-blowing. When the first licker you see jumps through the window in Resident Evil 2 and that scene plays, I couldn't believe it. Story 8, yes. Absolutely. They had polygons and textures and even lighting. It blew me away how realistic they looked. For example, this is the Tyrannosaurus Rex on the PlayStation Demo Disc 1. Story 9, they looked good. Not really realistic, but I kind of disagree with that being the standard to judge graphics on anyway. Story 10. Not realistic exactly, but you have to understand what was available at the time. They were pretty good for a computer and excellent compared to the consoles that came before. Gran Turismo was the game that made me buy a PlayStation. Story 11. They did not look any more realistic now than they did back then. My 10-year-old brain did not think Cloud's square hand was not square. Being in a three-dimensional world was the real game changer. My first holy moment was Half-Life 2. Story 12. As a child, I remember the opening scenes of Sonic Adventure impressing my dad with how everything looked. We only really had the Mega Drive before, and then Shenmue on the PlayStation 1. You could definitely see the advancements compared to the previous era. I still remember getting a PlayStation 2 and the WWE Just Bring It introduction movie blowing my mind. Story 13. It depends on the game and what was in the game. I recall being amazed by even just the first cutscene in Final Fantasy VIII with the water. However, there may have been an engine jump between some of my first PlayStation 1 games and that one. I was also about 12 years old, and this was after the Sega Genesis. Story 14. No, it really was not until the late 1990s when 3DFX had their Voodoo cards, which was after the PlayStation 1 came out. I would argue that games like Far Cry 1 or perhaps Crysis were the first signs of realistic graphics, and that was not until around 2003. However, CD games from the mid-1990s looked realistic because of motion capture. The games were dull, though. Story 15. I'm embarrassed to say yes. But we were also little kids who thought 240 pixels per inch was crystal clear resolution, and everything on television was seen through scan lines. Only in retrospect, after years of seeing things in higher resolutions and the advent of digital media, does looking back on old media make the low fidelity very obvious. Each subsequent generation of games was a huge leap in graphical fidelity, so it was easy to get excited over the evolution towards realism. In this sense, realism was more like tangible. Everything relied on being heavily stylized, and we were used to that. It did not mean photorealistic. Nowadays, people hype up ray tracing, real-time reflections, smooth edges, and high frame rates. Then they show 2 identical videos of the same game side by side, and I cannot fathom what all the excitement is about. Story 16. Realistic? It depends on what you mean by that. Obviously, they were not photorealistic. What tended to impress people were 1. Pre-rendered backgrounds. These could look fantastic. See Final Fantasy or Resident Evil for good examples. Full motion videos. Pre-rendered cutscenes and moving backgrounds that were inserted into the game. When Sony brought over Final Fantasy VII, the commercials just showed the full motion videos because they were considered groundbreaking at the time. Three-dimensional movement and controls. Moving from two-dimensional to three-dimensional was a huge deal, and this is where people thought the PlayStation 1 was more realistic. The Nintendo 64 also did three-dimensional graphics but did not have the memory for textures that the PlayStation 1 had, so later PlayStation 1 games tended to look better and more realistic. The jump that really impressed everyone for real-time three-dimensional graphics in-engine was the transition to the PlayStation 2. Comparing Metal Gear Solid to Metal Gear Solid 2, the difference is amazing. Story 17. I was excited about the graphics and couldn't imagine them getting any better. I still remember World Wrestling Federation games with real faces and thought it was peak technology. Story 18. There is still no realistic graphics, other than the latest artificial intelligence deepfakes. They just dropped the trailer for Electronic Arts College Football 26, and it does not look real. The bodies are weightless and unrealistic. When PlayStation 1 came out, it was progress, and I enjoyed it. Jet Moto 2 was a fun game. You could do flips and spins midair, but games still are not realistic. Story 19. I remember the open cinematic for Final Fantasy VIII. My God, we had arrived. It blew my 10-year-old mind how smooth it looked. Story 20. It was a massive jump forward in terms of graphics. Something to remember is that in 1995, when the PlayStation 1 launched, we had cathode ray tube televisions. Cathode ray tube televisions, not counting monitors, were pretty low quality. They fuzzed the edges of pixels, so games looked better than they would now on modern flat screens. Story 21. I didn't have a PlayStation 1 growing up, but I used to think Nintendo GameCube graphics were absolutely mind-blowing. Pokémon XD Gale of Darkness was such a beautiful game visually for me as a kid. Story 22. Tomb Raider was amazing. It looks ridiculous now, but it was a gameplay experience like no other at that time. Story 23. They looked awesome. The moment when the Tyrannosaurus Rex appeared in Tomb Raider was mind-blowing. Even large sprites and many frames of animation in two-dimensional fighters were incredible. Story 24. The first time I played Sonic the Hedgehog, I was amazed at how smooth the animation was on my home television. Story 25. Virtual Fighter 1 was the game I first experienced at a Toys R Us demonstration. It did not do anything different than Street Fighter 2 Turbo, but seeing depth added to the pixels was promising because it was the next step. Took a little while to get it looking good, and we have come so far since then. Story 26. I would not have said it looked realistic. It looked like a video game, but I would have said it had good graphics. Story 27. I remember the original Xbox and Xbox 360 both being huge leaps over what had come before. The Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1 were the first systems where three-dimensional graphics became the norm, so there were a lot of compromises and challenges as developers who had spent their whole careers making two-dimensional content had to switch to three-dimensional. If you wanted graphics that looked realistic in the mid-1990s, that usually meant full-motion video games with digital video of real actors or high-quality pixel art like in Master of Orion 2. Story 28. Final Fantasy VII Overworld did not look realistic, but it was cool. The cinematics and combat scenes, however, were amazing. Story 29. Yes, the jump in graphics quality was significant, although the graphics did not look completely realistic. Transitioning from a Super Nintendo Entertainment System to a PlayStation 1 was a major leap, and you no longer wanted to play on your Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 30. No, not really. But most games were three-dimensional and highly explorable, which was the selling point. The Nintendo 64 nailed the concept to its absolute best. Story 31. They were blocky, but if you compare Star Fox or Super FX Racer, they were obviously a step up. I also played computer games at that time and want to say we mostly played text games and AOL games that were very crude. Diablo 1 might have just come out too. You need to compare what was available and what came before. It looked way better than sprite-based games on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 32. They were not realistic, but the water graphics were amazing. It moved, allowing you to see underneath and look up through it, kind of transparent. It was impressive for its time. Story 33. No, real is not the right term. It was a jump for sure, but honestly, I remember thinking the Nintendo 64 looked better. However, no one was mistaking anything from that generation as real, just a significant leap forward. I would argue the earliest game I can remember with somewhat convincing environments was Myst, which predated the PlayStation 1 by about a year but required a personal computer. Around the PlayStation 2 and Xbox era, environments were becoming convincing in some console games. Story 34. No, laugh out loud. The two-dimensional games looked way better than what was on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Genesis, of course. But the three-dimensional graphics were unattractive even then. What was cool was the novelty of being able to move in 3 dimensions. Story 35. Nah, but they looked better than Nintendo 64 graphics in most cases. I remember playing Twisted Metal 2 again in the 2000s and was amazed at how poor it looked. So yes, those games looked a lot better when they were new. I really liked, and still like, the look of PlayStation 1 games that mix sprites with 3D like Final Fantasy Tactics and Castlevania. Symphony of the Night. That style held up really well. Story 36. Watching the Mario 64 demonstration on videotape that Nintendo mailed to me blew my young mind. To see Mario in 3-dimensional running around in this open world was astounding. Story 37. It was like seeing the box art from the Atari and Intellivision years fulfilling the promise of what the game would be. Story 38. For the most part, no. Impressive and unlike anything I had seen before, however. Except for Gran Turismo. I have no idea what magic they used, but at least in replays, I thought it had the most realistic graphics I had ever seen. Story 39. Depends. The original Gran Turismo looked realistic, not in the sense that it made you go, wow, is this an actual movie? But in the sense that between the detailed backgrounds, the smoothness, and the plausibility of the motion, it was all far beyond anything we had ever seen outside of an arcade. Then there was the cinematic aspect of it. The summons in Final Fantasy VII were nowhere near realistic, but they played as mini-movies with great camera and lighting work and an amazing soundtrack. The introduction to Tekken 3 still holds its own today. Imagine seeing it for the first time back then. Story 40. It really depended on the game. Games closer to its release had good graphics but were not realistic. Later games in that generation were a little better. The game with the best graphics I have seen was the cutscenes in Final Fantasy IX. They were close to being realistic. Story 41, hard to say as it is a matter of perspective, but yes, sort of back then, as there was nothing else that came that close. Obviously, looking back, you can literally see the pixels. PlayStation 2 era would be an easier leap. Something like the cutscenes in Final Fantasy XII were probably the best thing I had ever seen at that time. Story 42. Even if it was psychological, yes. Genesis and Super Nintendo used cartridges. PlayStation 1 used shiny discs and had a unique sound at the beginning for the first time, unlike anything else. Story 43. No, they just looked more realistic than 8-bit or 32-bit. It is more of a playing capability that sets it all apart. Games had more depth, more functionality, and better save options. Younger gamers will never know the frustration of old-school 8-bit save points or save codes. Old games were built to make you fail. That is why winning was everything. Story 44. Anyone else play with the Tyrannosaurus technology demonstration? Of course, it was not realistic, but it was much closer to reality than anything that came before. Story 45. Well, there was this game called Dungeons of Daggorath. Then we got these early PlayStation games. So no, they did not look realistic, but they looked much better. Story 46. I think most people were reacting to full motion videos and not the true capabilities, to be honest. I remember being blown away by Final Fantasy VII's full motion videos and battle graphics, but thinking the character models outside of combat looked really bad. Later PlayStation 1 games were actually quite good. But that was not the first impression. It was not really until the PlayStation 2 era that I really started thinking graphics were realistic. Story 47. Not really, not to me anyway. I happily stuck with my Super Nintendo Entertainment System for the entire PlayStation 1 era because, in my opinion, S-tier pixel graphics provided a more enjoyable experience than D-tier jagged, muddy polygon graphics. By the time the PlayStation 2 came out in 2000, which was a much more impressive console relatively speaking, I was already a dedicated personal computer gamer, so it would have felt like a lateral move. Story 48. It depended on the game itself. A title like Gran Turismo or Metal Gear Solid has a very different direction than, say, Crash Bandicoot or Spyro the Dragon. Story 49. No, but realistic has always been a relative term when it comes to gaming. Did it raise the standard? Yes. Was the standard quite low at that time? Also yes. Story 50. To be honest, the wow moment was Super Mario 64 for me. PlayStation was fantastic, and I had one at launch, but the killer early games were mostly sports. I would say that Crash Bandicoot followed by Super Mario 64 were really when that era took over. There is also the fact that 3D had already been out for a while and was not much less powerful than the PlayStation. Story 51. You went from the Super Nintendo to the PlayStation 1. The upgrade between those two systems was enormous. The power was literally double, and the games went from largely two-dimensional to three-dimensional. Story 52. PC gaming was popular back then as well, so it was not impressive. It was only impressive compared to other gaming consoles. Story 53. It was more gradual for me. I went from the Amiga computer to an Atari Jaguar and played Doom and Alien vs. Predator, which was a huge jump. Then I got a Panasonic 3DO and played Need for Speed, which impressed me the most. Shortly after, I got a Sony PlayStation and games like Wipeout looked great, but the graphics were not as big a leap from the Jaguar and 3DO. I bought way too many consoles during that time, including a Sega Saturn. Story 54. I would swear that Cool Borders 2, Madden 1998, WCW vs. NWO Revenge all looked so real, but seeing them now, it is just unbelievable. Story 55. No. I remember my mom seeing me play a Nintendo 64 game and commenting on how realistic the graphics looked. Even at 10 years old, I thought she was crazy for saying a bunch of jagged polygons looked realistic. However, three-dimensional gaming was definitely a big step forward. Early three-dimensional games were pretty mind-blowing and took some adjustment coming from only two-dimensional games. Story 56. I really did not play video games at all, other than a Game Boy for Pokemon in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Then one day my neighbor got a PlayStation 2 with SSX, and that looked awesome. Story 57. It was very game-dependent, but moving from Super Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Genesis to PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn, 3DO, and Atari Jaguar, I feel like there were more. Anyway, it was a huge leap, and true 3D on a console was pretty massive. The graphics were generally much better as well. Story 58. Yes, because at the time we had no idea what graphics today would look like. Can you imagine what graphics in 2050 will look like? Story 59. No. The reason is that I played Nintendo 64 before I played PlayStation 1. Graphics were better on Nintendo 64. They used triangle polygons, which were more versatile. PlayStation focused on quantity over quality. There were many games, but the graphics were not as good. When I first saw Nintendo 64, it absolutely blew me away. I couldn't believe how incredible it looked. The concept of 3D was mind-blowing. When I saw PlayStation 1, I was unimpressed. Story 60. I remember seeing a Final Fantasy VIII video and thinking about how cool it would be when gameplay looks like the cinematics. Story 61. You all do not understand the leap we had from the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Genesis era to something like the Nintendo 64 that could do three-dimensional real-time graphics. It was absolutely eye-popping at the time. Story 62. I mean, no, it did not look like a real proportional person, but it was not Mario Brothers pixels anymore, so it was amazing. Story 63. I remember Gran Turismo was the PlayStation 1 showcase for realistic graphics. That was one of the big sellers. Story 64. You have to appreciate that our previous experience with filled polygon 3D graphics was limited to games like Star Fox and Frontier Elite 2. Story 65. Virtua Fighter and similar games always looked terrible to me, even when they were new. As others have said, Innovation is not always attractive. You could say Super Metroid looks better than Virtua Fighter, but 16-bit graphics were just a refinement of 8-bit graphics. Super Metroid was released in 1994, so the developers had over a decade of experience working with basic pixels. Story 66. The leap to three-dimensional graphics was both impressive and awkward. At the launch of the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation, 16-bit graphics actually looked better because 16-bit art styles had essentially been perfected while three-dimensional polygonal characters and environments were still very new. It was not so much that PlayStation 1 titles looked amazing. It was that being able to explore spaces in 3 dimensions was a mind-blowing concept. Simple things like looking at an object from all different angles made it feel more realistic in the sense that we were interacting with this game world in the same way we interact with the real three-dimensional world around us. Story 67. Old console graphics definitely looked different on a cathode ray tube than on a digital screen today. However, I wouldn't call them exactly realistic. Story 68. You have to remember we started with Pong or Space Invaders, Pac-Man. Money for Nothing and the Lawnmower Man computer graphics were amazing. Story 69. Gran Turismo was marketed as the real driving simulator, and it did not really matter what it looked like because it felt real enough to be a revelation. Old Tomb Raider was a platformer in 3 dimensions. It was not realistic but felt great to play. Story 70. Just look at some screenshots of Battle Arena to Shinden, my first PlayStation game. Tell me if you think that looks realistic. It did more and different things than Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, but I don't think games in 2025 approach realism, so there you go. Story 71. I remember seeing Virtual Rally as a little kid for the first time. I had just been playing The Lost World on the Sega Mega Drive, which had some 3-dimensional sections that blew my tiny little mind. Seeing Virtual Rally melted my brain. Story 72. Final Fantasy VII was simultaneously the best thing we had ever seen and had us wondering why everyone had horse hooves instead of hands. Story 73. To me, it was amazing because it was such a big leap over previous generation consoles. In my opinion, no console generation change has been as significant since. PlayStation 4 looks a lot better than PlayStation 3, but it feels more iterative to me. Going from the higher-end Super Nintendo Entertainment System games like Donkey Kong Country or Star Fox to the full motion videos in Final Fantasy VII was a massive shift, even if it was still far from photorealism. Think Super Mario World to Super Mario 64 to Super Mario Sunshine. Sunshine certainly looks better than 64, but it is not like the leap from 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional that the previous generation made. Similarly, Super Mario World has better graphics than Super Mario 3, but they are much closer to each other than either is to Super Mario 64. The same kind of progression applies to Final Fantasy VI to 7 through 9 to X on PlayStation 2, or the evolution of the Legend of Zelda franchise. Story 74. Gran Turismo had us pumped. Also, the first modification you make is tires, then weight reduction, followed by brakes, suspension, and drivetrain. After that, you adjust the engine. There is no point in driving a 200 horsepower CRX if it cannot corner or brake. Story 75. It was definitely a step up, and the term realistic was used frequently, but you have to understand how low the standard was at the time. If you had some shapes stacked on top of other shapes with a 3-dimensional perspective, you were far ahead of the simple symbols we used to move around the screen. Story 76. Games that were fully 3-dimensional looked very poor, like blocks stacked on top of blocks. Prime examples include Tekken 1, Street Fighter EX, and Metal Gear Solid. However, game developers were clever and used still pre-rendered graphics for backgrounds, such as Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 9. Then there is Mortal Kombat, which used pictures of real people. I do not recall any other game using this technique. Story 77. Yes, compared to Nintendo or Atari, it felt like a huge improvement and looked real for a video game, if that makes sense. Story 78. Cathode ray tube displays showed things differently. They did not look the same on a cathode ray tube as they do now on a liquid crystal display, even if all the other hardware is the same. Television and movies also looked much worse than they do today. Gran Turismo 2 does not look much like a real-world 4K video on a liquid crystal display, but it does look remarkably realistic compared to 480i analog broadcasts on a 24-inch cathode ray tube on the other side of the room. Story 79. We were suspending our disbelief and using our imaginations intensely. The tricks they used with the textures to make it seem like there were more polygons than there actually were very effective because we were already exercising our imagination, and suddenly the weight felt much lighter. Story 80. When the PlayStation 1 first came out, the graphics were absolutely astonishing compared to everything before it. Of course, today they leave a little to be desired. Story 81. No, it was a rough time. The PlayStation 1 had notoriously long load times and was not on the same level as PC games at the time, especially when we already had Doom, Heretic, and Hexen. The first game that blew me away, transitioning from two-dimensional to three-dimensional, was The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, not necessarily because of the graphics but because it was an amazingly well-done transition. The Nintendo 64 games were comparable to PlayStation 1 except they had much faster load times. I remember being optimistic that three-dimensional games would look amazing in the future, and I feel similarly about artificial intelligence now. Story 82. I was one of the few critics less impressed by three-dimensional graphics. We had gone from high-resolution two-dimensional graphics, which in some cases were carefully digitized and photorealistic, to three-dimensional graphics with limited texture resolutions. So much of the screen was smeared by low-resolution-looking texture elements. The PlayStation 1 often did not even perform perspective correction, so the textures were jaggy and wavy. It was a difficult compromise for me personally to accept. The Sega Dreamcast was the first system to have three-dimensional graphics that did not feel like a huge step backward. The PlayStation 2 was difficult to program, so for the first year or so, it looked more like PlayStation 1.5. However, after the first year, there were some games that managed to retain high resolution while achieving three-dimensional graphics. Story 83. Yes, we were watching graphics improve year by year. The best example was going from 16-bit Final Fantasy VI on Super Nintendo Entertainment System to Final Fantasy VII polygons, which seemed crazy, but then Final Fantasy VIII was so realistic. Story 84. It was not so much that they were realistic, but a significant leap compared to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System or Sega Genesis. What was new was the range of movement. Outside of a few games such as Star Fox, games both looked two-dimensional and moved in two dimensions. Now, not only did things on screen look three-dimensional, characters could move in three dimensions. Story 85. My dad and I were absolutely amazed by the dinosaur walking in the dark, which was a technology demonstration that came with the PlayStation 1 demonstration disc. We had upgraded from a Mega Drive, so it was a significant experience. I remember thinking the water in Tomb Raider looked like real life. It is amazing to look back at the graphics now, as many games are so poorly designed visually that they are unplayable. Story 86. Not realistic, but better than two-dimensional sprites. Now PlayStation 2 and GameCube definitely. It was a huge jump. Super Mario 64 to Super Mario Sunshine felt like a generational leap. Mario did not look blocky anymore, and the water looked real. I feel like we will never experience such a big jump again. Compare Mario from Sunshine to Mario from the upcoming Mario Kart world, and the difference is very subtle, almost non-existent. Story 87. A jump in quality with improved physics and lighting modeling, certainly. Big discussion about how many polygons there were, sure, but I do not remember anyone actually saying PlayStation 1 graphics looked realistic. Story 88. Yes and no. We did not literally think 32-bit or 64-bit was, this is real life. We still understood textures, clipping, and how some of the worlds were comparatively empty. But compared to what we had in 1992 or even 1986, it was light years ahead. The opening sequence in Final Fantasy VII was mind-blowing. Super Mario 64 in an open world in any direction with a movable camera, as janky as it was, provided a completely new feel and understanding of how things worked and what could come next. For us, it felt like jumping from the computer graphics in The Lawnmower Man to seeing Davy Jones in Pirates of the Caribbean 2. We know it is not real, but it felt so impressive. Story 89. Personally, I thought the early PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 games were a major step back from the era of hand-drawn sprites. They were much less detailed, and for what smoother movements? Who cares? The PlayStation 2 and Dreamcast, now those blew me away. but I always felt like 3D hit consoles about a generation before the hardware was really ready. Story 90. I remember when the Nintendo Entertainment System came out and Super Mario Bros. Looked and sounded exactly like the arcade game. That had never happened before. Previously, you would have the real version of the game and the low-resolution Atari version. Story 91. The first time I saw a Demolition Derby, my mind was blown. Let's also not forget Ridge Racer. This game was directly from the arcade, which was unheard of back then. Story 92. The leap from the Super Nintendo Entertainment System to the PlayStation 1 was a very big deal. I was always after the next big thing from the Atari onward, and those games did things nothing before them could come close to. Look at Final Fantasy 6 to 7 for a leap of just a few years as an example. That kind of progress was commonplace back then. Story 93. It was not PlayStation 1 graphics that impressed me. It was Nintendo 64 graphics. That was the first time I could control a character in a full three-dimensional world. It was a huge leap from what had come before. I went from playing sprite-based role-playing games and side-scrollers to being able to swim through the water or fly through the sky. Imagine suddenly gaining the ability to fly tomorrow. Felt like that. Story 94. The first three-dimensional game I saw was Virtua Fighter on Sega Saturn, and it was mind-blowing at the time. It looked so cool. Then I was amazed again when I saw Soul Calibur on Sega Dreamcast. Story 95. For me, it was the cutscenes in Final Fantasy VII that had me thinking, this is it. Graphics never have to be better than this. So, sort of. Story 96. Yes. When I first played Metal Gear Solid, I was blown away. I thought it looked completely realistic. I also thought many cutscenes in games were incredible. I am getting old. Story 97. After Sega? Hell yeah, they looked very real. Although I didn't play PlayStation 1 much and had a PlayStation 2 instead. That looked very realistic at the time, especially next to my PC, which was so weak I had to look away from explosions in Grand Theft Auto Vice City to preserve my frame rate. Story 98. What was meant by realistic back then was not that it could be mistaken for video of real objects. It was more like a better representation of real-world objects and physics than previously seen. Story 99. Compared to what had come before, yes, it was a huge difference going from a Nintendo Entertainment System to a PlayStation 1 or Nintendo 64. The PlayStation 1, in particular, could pack in impressive cutscenes on their CD-based discs. Final Fantasy VII was pretty awe-inspiring. Each new generation has mostly blown me away, but the PlayStation 1 was definitely a new benchmark for graphics. The PlayStation 3 was the first generation where I couldn't necessarily tell if a clip from a game was gameplay or a rendered cutscene. The quality of gameplay had finally caught up. Now, with the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5, I couldn't readily tell which clip came from which console. Things have kind of plateaued, but the jump into 3D was revolutionary. Also, keep in mind that the PlayStation 1 games were played on standard definition cathode ray tube television sets. The lower resolution helped hide some of the blockiness and lower polygon counts. Story 100. Not really. People had been playing the Super Nintendo Entertainment System for a while when the PlayStation came out. Arcades at the time already had graphics that were on par with or better than the PlayStation. The PlayStation was great, but it felt more like progress was being made rather than a major graphics revolution. The Nintendo 64 felt similar when it was released a year later. I think The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time and Grand Theft Auto 3 for the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 2 were the real powerhouses of their respective consoles. Those titles helped people see what the future held. Story 101. Most games, I would say no, but PlayStation 1 racing games were so far ahead of the competition for realism that they represented a paradigm shift. You have to compare to what came before, not what came after. Story 102. I mean, you could get much closer to realistic than before, especially with games that utilized pre-rendered backgrounds like Resident Evil and Final Fantasy VII. Also, PlayStation had actual cutscenes. But it's not like we played Twisted Metal and thought, wow, so real. Story 103. I thought Gran Turismo was incredibly realistic. Low resolution for sure, but quite realistic. It blew my mind. Now, maybe not so much. Story 104. I was in 5th grade, I think, when it was released. The graphics were cool and three-dimensional, but the edgy advertising campaigns stood out even more to me. It made both the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Genesis look like children's games. Story 105. "Hey dude, don't cut yourself with the saw in that wall," was a common phrase those days. You could get stuck on a pixel in the first Tony Hawk's game and earn infinite points. Story 106. Not realistic, but just mind-blowing as a kid when the best three-dimensional graphics some of us had seen so far were Super FX games like Star Fox on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 107. It was partly imagination and partly what the older television screens displayed. Old screens had a slight blurriness, which enhanced many of the older visuals. Story 108. The transition from two-dimensional to three-dimensional was really rough back then, and in my opinion, graphics looked poor in the PlayStation 1 era compared to the previous generation. However, computer-generated imagery cutscenes started becoming more prevalent, and the graphics in those were impressive. Gameplay in three-dimensional was a big improvement, except for all the issues with cameras in that era. Story 109. The first thing I remember thinking was so real was Pitfall. You could see the arms and legs moving, which was a big step. Next was summer games on the Commodore 64. Those are what stood out by the mid-1980s. Story 110. For the time, it was amazing, but 1980s games already deceived us with elaborate oil painting box covers for 8-bit graphic games. Children expected Pitfall Harry in the game to match the box cover with photorealism. Why advertise it if it is not true? That kind of advertising has numbed us to false promises and improved graphics. We know what realism is. Computer games are not realistic, especially in the early days of PlayStation 1. Story 111. PlayStation 2 was the first time I can remember magazines and people talking about how realistic graphics were. The PlayStation 1 era did not have the storage media to hold good textures and detailed models. Story 112. My memories of games were much more realistic than actually going back to play the game and realizing it is nearly unplayable now. Story 113. I distinctly remember Gran Turismo 2 on PlayStation 1 at my dad's house. I must have been about 10 years old. I showed him how realistic it looked. He said, "What car is that? You can't even see ahead. You can't even see the signs." I said it was obviously a Mazda MX-5, also known as a Miata. I didn't agree with him. It seemed very realistic to 10-year-old me. I played Gran Turismo 2 on a PlayStation 1 in a video game nightclub last week. You cannot see the corners until you are about 20 virtual yards away. I now agree with him. Story 114. The brain filled in the gaps. Keep in mind, we were mostly playing in 480p on smaller televisions. A 32-inch screen was a common size for living rooms. It was about having so much on screen at once. Looking back, it can be rough. At the time, it was fresh and you did not have 1,000 other things competing for your attention. Story 115. Go to YouTube right now and look up the attack on the Death Star briefing scene from Star Wars Episode 4. A New Hope. There is a computer-generated imagery projection of the Death Star that everyone is studying as they prepare for the upcoming battle. This scene and its entirely computer-generated imagery rendering of the Death Star was a monumental achievement at the time and represented the first fully computer-generated graphic in a Hollywood feature film. You went to see an epic science fiction movie, and they gave you literal science fiction, a computer-generated and animated image. You will notice immediately that the Death Star's circular laser dish is centered upon the projected sphere's equator, not in its northern hemisphere. The technological limitations of that time, especially in rendering a complex three-dimensional shape and then animating it, meant that making that shape asymmetric, like having the laser dish in only the northern hemisphere, was impossible. In 1979, when A New Hope came out, people noticed the dish was not where it was relative to matte-painted and model versions of the Death Star that appeared on screen, but the futuristic inclusion of computer-generated imagery made it acceptable. Watching the original trilogy movies as a kid in the 1990s on video home system tapes, the special effects of those films were still good enough to compete with the new material coming out at the time. I noticed the odd computer-generated imagery as a kid and did not care because it fit seamlessly and no one seemed to mind on screen. As computer-generated imagery became more common and more affordable for producers to include, the poor quality computer-generated imagery of productions like Transformers, Beast Wars became less acceptable and increasingly troublesome. You only noticed how low polygonal objects were when the next generation of graphics came out and demonstrated how something looked with 1,000 times more polygons defining its shape. When the PlayStation 1 came out, we had all been playing on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn, and lower-quality home personal computers. The PlayStation 1 debuted with high polygon counts, excellent frame rates, three-dimensional image acceleration, and games came on compact discs. It was a revelation at the time, even if we looked at Final Fantasy VII graphics and saw that characters were essentially made of balloon animal shapes. It was super modern, so that was acceptable. When the PlayStation 2 came out and Final Fantasy X was gorgeous, that changed. When the PlayStation 3 came out along with Final Fantasy XV, we looked back at Final Fantasy X as if it were garbage. It will be the same with the PlayStation 6 when Final Fantasy XX comes out. Story 116. The Nintendo 64 was a significant leap in technology. I remember seeing the chin strap move while a player was trash-talking in the first PlayStation 2 Madden commercial, and it really impressed me. That, along with the Final Fantasy X cutscenes, stood out. Story 117. Echoing what many are saying, think of this. From the 1980s through the early 2000s, it was like seeing a spark, then a fire, then a blowtorch, and then a firework for the first time. They were immense jumps. Now, it feels like instead of seeing a firework for the first time, it is looking at different colors and configurations of fireworks. Nowadays, it is hard to recognize the vast leaps until you go back and play a PlayStation 3 or even PlayStation 4 game and see the difference. Story 118. You do not understand. We did not have three-dimensional before that. We had side-scrolling or versions of that. The idea of an interactive 360-degree environment you could move around in did not exist yet. PlayStation and Sega Saturn were revolutionary. Story 119. I was in 4th or 5th grade when we got a PlayStation 1. I was so excited about it. I don't remember thinking, oh, this is just like real life, or anything like that. I remember the gameplay was what made the game special for me. Spyro, Twisted Metal, Mega Man X4, Digimon World 2, and others. I think it was when I played some PlayStation 2 games that I felt the experience was realistic, but I was also older. During my 9th grade summer, I had the PlayStation 2, and I got really into Grand Theft Auto. Story 120. Go and look at the original Spyro games on the PlayStation 1. Now go and look at Spyro Reignited. To a very young me back then, the PlayStation 1 version looked exactly like Reignited does now. Story 121. I was at the mall in San Diego near the Gaslamp District. I saw Twisted Metal in the mall. I played it for about 5 minutes. It blew my mind. I got the Nintendo 64 a few months later. Story 122. I played Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1 at the age of 8. I still don't remember it as realistic, but those polygons were terrifying. As long as you know what it's supposed to be, your brain fills in detail gaps. However, I don't think I would have called it, or Crash Bandicoot or Soul Reaver, realistic. The first game I looked at and thought, man, the realism is getting good, was Half-Life 2. The Sega Dreamcast had better graphics than the PlayStation 1, but the PlayStation's list of games was outstanding. Story 123. I have a strong recollection of walking through a Toys R Us after the Nintendo 64 was released, seeing a football match playing on the TV in the store, and then realizing the football match was a video game, Madden, and that what my friend had told me was true. From stadium camera level, it absolutely looked like a real match to me. Story 124. The first time I plugged in and played my Nintendo 64, my immediate thought was that video game graphics and play were never going to be better than Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. Story 125. Not even remotely realistic, but the jump to actual 3D was mind-blowing at the time. The PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube generation was the first time I remember being properly blown away, playing Final Fantasy X and Tekken Tag Tournament. I remember not being able to tell the difference at the time between the cinematic and in-engine cutscenes in Final Fantasy X. Today, you can absolutely see the difference. It was a huge leap over the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 era. Story 126. I remember being amazed by Ocarina of Time's open world and graphics, and calling my dad over to see how realistic it looked. Story 127. I always thought they looked like video games. Some of them hold up pretty well, such as Tekken 3, Final Fantasy After 7, and Chrono Cross. However, there was never a point where I looked at a very pretty game and thought, wow, I can't tell the difference between this and reality. Story 128. They were just like not two-dimensional sprites. However, I was a personal computer gamer as well, so they were nothing special. One weird thing is that most people still did not have home computers at the time of the PlayStation 1 release. That came a few years later. Also, personal computers were going through rapid evolution. Three-dimensional accelerator cards were becoming a thing. PlayStation 1 games were less impressive to someone with a nice gaming personal computer but were amazing to people who had nothing. It was an interesting time. Quake, which came out a year or so after the PlayStation, was the first actual three-dimensional first-person shooter, and the console ports were unimpressive. Story 129. You've got to understand that we do not see the same leaps in graphical fidelity today that we did back then. In one console generation, we went from pixel sprites to three-dimensional models. Today, a new generation of consoles might increase the texture maps or make models more detailed, but nothing quite so fundamentally norm-breaking. The closest we have come is virtual reality, but even that is struggling to become common. Story 130. You have to understand it wasn't just graphics. It was that we were controlling three-dimensional objects in a three-dimensional space. It could have been a cube bouncing around in a white room, and it still would have been the most incredible gaming experience of all time. Frankly, it wasn't the PlayStation 1 that blew people away. It was the Nintendo 64. They came out of the gate with Mario 64, and that game was flawless. Then they hit us with The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. All of these things happened within about 2 years of each other. Then came the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and the Xbox. It all happened really fast. It seemed like once a year there was some mind-blowing advance in gaming technology. Story 131. Yes, I was blown away. I remember us standing around marveling at it. It is kind of comical to look back on compared to what I see with games today. We knew it was a new age in gaming and it has just gotten better and better. It is pretty amazing. Story 132. It looked cool but not realistic. I couldn't get past the texture warping effect of the PlayStation 1. Before then, Doom, that's when I thought as an early teen that video games were over. There was never going to be anything better looking than Doom. Story 133. When I go back and emulate PlayStation 1 games, they always look worse than I remember. At the time, it was next level. Story 134. They did not look super realistic, but it was a huge improvement. If you look at it now, it resembles a 3D shape simulator. A more direct example that affected me as you described is that for the longest time, I thought the graphics in Final Fantasy X were fine. To me, characters did not need to look more realistic. So I would say the PlayStation 2 convinced me. It looked as realistic as people say. Story 135. No, not realistic but amazed by how it was three-dimensional. I do remember being blown away by how realistic the Xbox, PlayStation 2, and GameCube looked, especially the stitches in Mario's overalls in Super Smash Bros. Melee. Story 136. Yes, it all felt amazing because what came before did not have crazy graphics. Not PlayStation 1, although I had one, but I remember my dad buying me Oblivion and an Xbox 360 and talking about how realistic it was. Now you look at it, and it is just average. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.